Hey there, this is your teacher, Mr. H, and you're watching History in a Hoodie. Today's episode is about Reconstruction in the South, where we'll learn all about how Southern society was upended after the Civil War. I can't wait to find out, so let's get this show started. What are we learning about today? The standard for today's lesson asks the students to compare and contrast the goals and outcomes of the Freedmen's Bureau and the Ku Klux Klan. We will also examine reasons for and the effects of the removal of African American legislatures from the Georgia General Assembly during Reconstruction. Finally, we will give examples of goods and services produced during the Reconstruction era, including the use of sharecropping and tenant farming. Before we start, let's go over some vocabulary for today's lesson. The Freedmen's Bureau was a federal agency set up to assist freed slaves in obtaining relief, land, jobs, fair treatment, and education. The Ku Klux Klan was a terrorist group operating in the South working to maintain white supremacy in racial relations. A sharecropper is a farmer who gives part of each crop as rent for land, tools, animals, and seed. A tenant farmer is a farmer who gives a smaller part of each crop only for renting the land. Immediately following the Civil War, there was massive upheaval in the societal structure of the southern states, including Georgia. For hundreds of years prior to the Civil War, nothing had changed in the relationship between the racial groups. And suddenly, with the stroke of a pen, everything changed for both major racial groups. Once the chains of slavery control were broken, the relationship between Southern whites and the freedmen would never be the same again. Freedmen learned that they had rights, finally, and immediately wanted to take advantage of them by trying to undo all the harm that centuries of slavery had caused. They needed help, however, because almost no freedmen had received any education during their enslavement. For slave owners, this was for a very practical matter. If a slave couldn't read or write, they couldn't communicate plans for uprising against their slave masters. Following the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau was organized to help educate freedmen and help them understand their new freedoms. The Freedmen's Bureau built schools, including two of Georgia's historically black colleges, Clark Atlanta University and Morehouse College, and also hospitals, shelters, and food kitchens. They represented freedmen in labor disputes and helped them find work. While many former slaves migrated immediately following the Civil War in the Great Migration to the big northern cities like Chicago and New York, those that stayed behind in Georgia and other southern states needed to find work to survive. The economy of the South wasn't going to change rapidly just because of a war. Cotton was still king. So, many former slaves became farmers on old plantations working under former slave masters. New arrangements were made between the farm owners and the workers. Different from slavery, but only just a bit. Sharecropping was an arrangement where a freedman would work a portion of the land. Because a sharecropper didn't own his own tools, land, seed, or animals, the sharecropper would have to pay back the landowner nearly his entire crop, and would make almost no profit from the labor. Tenant farming wasn't very different, except the freedmen would come with some tools and equipment, and would keep a little more profit from their labor. In both cases, most freedmen working on the farms still remained heavily indebted to the landowners. Just because the results of a war and a couple pieces of paper were signed into law up in Washington, D.C., all said that African Americans gained their freedom, didn't mean that Southern society was immediately going to embrace their new freedoms. Centuries of thinking weren't going to be changed overnight, and freedmen's equality wouldn't be accepted by most. For some Southern whites, this meant ignoring, refusing service, or poor treatment. But others took a more radical approach. The Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, began just 2 years following the Civil War as a social club for former Confederate soldiers. They eventually began to use terrorism to intimidate newly freed African Americans and any whites that supported them. Using intimidation, physical violence, and murder against the freedmen, the KKK established continual social control over African Americans and promotion of white supremacy for another century. One group that the KKK directly worked against was the new African American politicians in Georgia. The 15th Amendment granted freedmen the right to vote, and vote they did. 32 freedmen were elected to the Georgia legislature, promising to improve the lives of former slaves. They managed to be elected in some rural counties because African American former slaves greatly outnumbered the white former slave owners in the areas. The victory for African Americans wasn't an easy one to begin with. The KKK threatened the candidates running for office and voters heading to the polls. And it was completely undone immediately. Immediately after the legislature first met following these elections, Georgia's General Assembly voted to expel almost all of the black legislators. Usually used for politicians who commit unlawful crimes, expulsion was used against these African Americans for reasons that, quote, persons of color as non-citizens were not entitled to hold office under Georgia's Constitution. In elections following, Georgians would get more creative in suppressing black politicians from winning office, including charging taxes for voting, which most freedmen couldn't afford, requiring literacy tests to vote, which most freedmen couldn't pass, or straight up tearing up votes. Things wouldn't be changing anytime soon. So what? What would it take for racial relations to improve in the South? In the 1860s, the Reconstruction Amendments were passed, which guaranteed African Americans freedom, citizenship, and the right to vote. This didn't result in equality in Southern culture, but it was better than slavery. In the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement was led by a charismatic young preacher, and the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Acts were passed into law. This still didn't result in total equality in Southern culture, but it was surely better than the Jim Crow laws in the South. While today you can say that a majority of people in the South care more about a person's character than the color of their skin, a majority isn't enough. We still don't have total equality in Southern culture thanks to those few holdouts. But it is surely better than it was a few decades ago. And it will be better a few decades from now. Slavery existed on this continent for almost 250 years before the Civil War. And that is 250 years of inequality between the races. The only factor that's affecting the improvement of racial relations in our state and our region now is time. Now what? What am I going to do with this information? The Ku Klux Klan fizzled out completely after the Civil Rights Movement when it was clear that African Americans were going to win their rights through popular support back in the 1960s. Oh wait, no, that isn't correct. The KKK is going strong today and has seen a growth in support in the last 3 years, according to a U.S. and World News report. There are currently statewide organizations of the KKK in Georgia, and the group still works to suppress the rights and social equality of minority groups, including African Americans, Hispanics, Jews, LGBT groups, and others. I have no problem stating out loud that the KKK is bad. They're listed as a hate group by the SPLC and are on a watch list for potential homegrown terrorists. Their history of violence and intimidation for white supremacy hasn't weakened since their earliest beginnings. It has just become sneakier. Here's the thing though. I am almost certainly going to get a nasty call or email from someone about this video. Someone may even ask me to take this video down because I'm influencing young people with my opinions. Because even in 2018, we can't all agree that the KKK is bad. The fact that in 2018 we can't all agree that the KKK is bad should tell you something about how life is different for the different races in our state and our country. There is still hate out there for different racial groups, and while those people may be very few, they can have an effect on the fairness of society. I have never been told in my life, we don't serve your type around here, but I know people who have, and I feel sympathy for them. We can't pretend the issue doesn't exist in our state because ignorance of an issue only prolongs it. The first step to solving a problem is recognizing there is a problem. Wow, so learning about social reconstruction is really important for us to understand. I'm glad we learned it today. Are you ready for some review questions? The purpose of the Freedmen's Bureau was to members of the KKK most likely intimidated Southern voters in order to When the 14th Amendment was ratified, Georgia was readmitted into the Union and citizenship was granted to blacks. While this amendment led to positive outcomes, it also resulted in a setback for some black leaders. Which statement describes this major setback? After the Civil War, what lifestyle did many freed slaves adopt? I hope all of you learned a lot from today's episode of History in a Hoodie about the Reconstruction era. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Just kidding, I don't care about that stuff. But do make sure you study this lesson. Bye now.